Good day. Today's lecture is devoted to methods of learning, with particular emphasis on verbal methods. This topic is especially important because verbal interaction remains one of the central means through which knowledge is transmitted, interpreted, and developed in higher education. Even in the context of digital transformation, speech continues to play a decisive role in organizing thought, clarifying concepts, and guiding academic communication. Therefore, the study of verbal methods is essential for understanding how university teaching achieves both intellectual depth and pedagogical effectiveness. At the outset, the lecture formulates its aim through the idea of an individual approach. The task is to find such approaches that each student can master the material successfully. This is pedagogically significant because verbal methods should never be applied mechanically. On the contrary, they must be adapted to students' level of preparation, pace of understanding, and mode of participation. Accordingly, the lecture is concerned not only with the description of verbal methods, but also with their purposeful and differentiated use in real teaching practice. This slide emphasizes the constant expansion of pedagogical methods. Innovative technologies, digital tools, and new organizational models continue to enrich educational practice. At the same time, this diversity is not simply a sign of change for its own sake. Rather, it reflects the continuous modernization of education and the need to explore new teaching possibilities. Therefore, the study of methods remains an open and dynamic field. The teacher must not only know established approaches, but also remain prepared to rethink them in light of changing educational conditions. A teaching method is defined here as a way of joint activity between teacher and students directed toward educational aims. This definition is especially important because it presents the method not as the action of the teacher alone, but as an organized form of pedagogical interaction. The slide also refers to Bebansky, who describes the method as a system of interconnected actions of teacher and learners. In addition, it distinguishes the technique as a component part of the method. Consequently, methods and techniques should be understood as flexible and interrelated elements of pedagogical work, rather than as isolated devices. The next slide introduces several well-known classifications of teaching methods. Lerner and Skatkin classify methods according to the nature of cognitive activity, including explanatory-illustrative, reproductive, problem-based, and research forms. Danilov and Esipov classify methods by their didactic purpose. Dewey, by contrast, relates method to activity, experience, and problem solving. This comparison is methodologically valuable because it shows that teaching methods may be approached from different theoretical positions. Therefore, no single classification exhausts the pedagogical reality. Rather, each highlights a particular aspect of educational activity. This slide explains why verbal methods occupy a leading place in education. First, they allow large amounts of information to be transmitted quickly. Second, drawing on Vygotsky, the slide emphasizes that speech is a principal tool of thinking development and social interaction. Third, the modern pedagogical view recognizes that verbal methods become most effective when combined with visual and practical approaches. Thus, the value of verbal methods lies not only in their efficiency, but also in their developmental role. They do not merely convey knowledge. They help organize thought itself. The lecture then turns to two major verbal methods, story and explanation. Story is described as oral, figurative, and logical, while the reference to Ushinsky underscores that clarity and accessibility are fundamental requirements. Explanation, by contrast, is presented as verbal interpretation of laws and concepts through cause and effect reasoning, argumentation, and analogy. These two methods differ in emphasis. Story is especially effective where material must be made vivid and accessible. Explanation is indispensable where conceptual precision and logical understanding are required. Therefore, the teacher must distinguish carefully between them and use each according to educational purpose. This slide presents conversation and discussion as dialogical verbal methods. Conversation is linked with the Socratic principle that truth may be approached through questions and answers. Discussion, in turn, is understood as an exchange of opinions, and the reference to Freire emphasizes dialogue as a form of conscious learning. The pedagogical significance of these methods is clear. Unlike one-directional transmission, they require students to think aloud, respond, compare positions, and justify ideas. Consequently, conversation and discussion not only transmit knowledge but also cultivate reasoning, communication, and intellectual participation. The slide devoted to the lecture identifies several formats: traditional, problem-based, binary, visualization, and interactive lectures. This range is especially important because it demonstrates that the lecture, although often considered traditional, is internally diverse and methodologically flexible. The reference to Brunner adds a significant point. Problem presentation stimulates cognitive interest and motivates independent inquiry. Therefore, even within lecture-based teaching, the teacher may choose forms that vary considerably in their level of student activation and intellectual challenge. The next slide extends verbal methods beyond oral communication and into text-based independent work. Key techniques include note-taking, outlining, summarizing, annotation, and referencing. In the digital era, these practices are supported by electronic libraries, databases, and online platforms. The reference to Bloom is especially meaningful here. Stable learning outcomes require active, independent processing. Thus, verbal methods remain important not only when the teacher speaks, but also when students work with texts in an analytical and self-directed manner. This slide broadens the discussion by connecting verbal methods with other forms of modern teaching. Seminars deepen knowledge and develop academic speech. Excursions connect theory with direct observation. Innovation appears through project-based learning, gamification, and digital platforms. Accordingly, verbal methods should not be isolated from the wider pedagogical system. On the contrary, they are most effective when integrated with practical, observational, and innovative forms of educational activity. The concluding thematic slide summarizes the pedagogical power of verbal methods in 3 directions. Explanation and lecture provide the foundation of knowledge delivery. Conversation and discussion develop thinking and communication. Flexible combination ensures that methods correspond to educational goals and student needs. This final point is especially important. No verbal method is universally sufficient on its own. The real strength of verbal pedagogy lies in the teacher's capacity to combine methods thoughtfully and purposefully according to context. Thank you for your attention. I hope this lecture has clarified the main verbal methods of learning and has shown how their thoughtful use contributes to knowledge acquisition, intellectual development, and effective pedagogical communication.